January 28, 1942, Burbank, California. The parking lot at Lockheed Vega Aircraft. 60 women stepped off buses into the cold morning air, their breath visible in the California dawn. They wore new work clothes, stiff dungarees that still smelled of the store, hair tied back in bandanas they'd fashioned from household fabric. Most had never held a rivet gun. Most had never worked in a factory at all. They were Pearl Harbor widows, and they had come to build the machines that would carry the war back across the Pacific. Their motto, printed in newspapers across the country that same week, was simple: "Keep 'em flying to avenge our husbands' deaths." 7 weeks earlier, their husbands had died at anchor in Hawaii. Now these women would shape aluminum into wings. The factory doors opened. Inside, the sound was immediate and total, a mechanical roar that swallowed individual voices, replaced conversation with gesture and proximity, the smell of hot metal and machine oil, the visual chaos of partially assembled fuselages hanging from overhead cranes, their skeletal ribs exposed, aluminum skins waiting to be fitted, drilled, riveted into place, 100 drill presses chattering, the pneumatic hammer strike of rivet guns echoing off concrete floors. This was not the world these women knew, but it was the world they would inhabit now, 8 hours at a time, sometimes more, sometimes through the night, until the war ended or until their bodies gave out. 1942 was the year America's industrial capacity pivoted from potential to actuality. It was the year the war stopped being a distant catastrophe and became a domestic imperative. And it was the year women, by the tens of thousands, walked into factories that had been designed, built, and operated by men, and remade them from the inside. Before Pearl Harbor, the question was not whether women could work in war factories. The question was whether they would be allowed to. In October 1941, fewer than 10,000 women worked in aircraft assembly plants across the United States. The industry was expanding rapidly. Production had climbed from 3,611 aircraft in 1940 to over 18,000 in 1941. But labor remained overwhelmingly male. Employers were reluctant, union leaders were skeptical. The popular media reinforced traditional gender roles, suggesting that a woman's place during wartime was at home, supporting her husband or her son, not on a factory floor. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor did not merely kill 2,400 Americans, it restructured the entire logic of industrial labor. Men who had been drilling holes in wing spars were suddenly gone, shipped to boot camps in the South, to training fields in Texas, to the Pacific. The assembly lines did not stop, they accelerated. President Roosevelt called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942, then revised the goal upward. The factories needed bodies, skilled bodies if possible, but bodies nonetheless. By spring 1942, 9 times as many women were employed in aircraft assembly as had been employed in the fall of 1941. This was not gradual integration. This was industrial necessity moving faster than cultural resistance could organize itself. The training programs appeared almost overnight. Public vocational schools, operating under National Defense Training funding, began admitting women after December 7th. Private fee-charging schools followed. The courses were short, sometimes as brief as a few weeks, rarely longer than 6 months. They taught riveting first, because riveting was everywhere, because every aircraft was held together by hundreds of thousands of rivets, because the sound of rivet guns became the sonic signature of the war effort itself. Riveting required strength, but not brute strength. It required coordination. It required the ability to work in tight spaces, inside a wing, inside a fuselage, contorted into positions where a taller or broader worker could not fit. Women, it turned out, were good at this, better than anticipated, better, in some cases, than the men they replaced. Drilling came next, operating a drill press, learning to read blueprints, to measure tolerances down to thousandths of an inch, to recognize when a hole was misaligned before the rivet went in. Then spot welding, which required even less training and which women adapted to with surprising speed. Then assembly work, fitting subcomponents together, guiding massive fuselage sections onto jigs with the help of counterweights and pneumatic lifts. The technology adapted to accommodate them. At Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, production engineers installed counterweights for moving large segments of planes, upgraded older manual machines to electric or pneumatic operation. These changes also made male workers more efficient, but they were implemented explicitly to allow women into positions previously considered too physically demanding. The assumption had been that women would need more supervision, would be harder to manage, would increase labor turnover. The opposite happened. Reports from employers in 1942 noted that women required less supervision, were decidedly easier to supervise, and that labor turnover noticeably decreased after women were hired. Once women were employed in a plant, male employees made little objection to the employment of additional women workers. The resistance dissolved, not because attitudes changed, but because production schedules did not allow time for resistance. March 1942, Seattle, Washington. Boeing plant. Number 2, the B-17 Flying Fortress. 4 engines. Wingspan 103 feet. Empty weight 36,000 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight 65,000 pounds. 10 crew members. 13 machine guns in later variants. Range 2,000 miles with a 6,000-pound bomb load. In early 1942, Boeing was producing approximately 60 B-17s per month. This was insufficient. The 8th Air Force, preparing for daylight bombing raids over Europe, would require hundreds, then thousands. The production rate had to double, then triple, then double again. The assembly line at Plant Number 2 operated in stages. Fuselages moved down the line on wheeled dollies. Wings were assembled separately, then mated to the fuselage with massive bolts. Engines were installed, electrical systems wired, gun turrets fitted, control surfaces attached, paint applied, though camouflage schemes were often abandoned as unnecessary, given the volume of aircraft leaving the factory. Women worked every stage. Regina Sawina Tolfelt, later known as Regina Tolfelt, was one of approximately 15,000 women who would work in Boeing's Seattle factories during the war. Her job was specific. She drilled the holes for the rivets that fastened the bomber's aluminum skin to its ribs. 8 hours a day, 7 days a week at the apex of production. She worked inside the wing jigs. The wing of a B-17 was not a single piece. It was a structure, ribs, spars, stringers, all held together by rivets and covered with thin aluminum sheets. The interior was cramped, dark, illuminated by work lights clipped to the structure itself. The drill was pneumatic, loud even through ear protection. The aluminum shavings were sharp. The work was repetitive. Drill, measure, check alignment, move to the next position, repeat. At the peak of production in April 1944, Boeing Plant Number 2 would produce 362 B-17s in a single month. On one day, 16 bombers were completed and flown away in a 24-hour period. But that was 2 years away. In March 1942, the factory was still learning, still hiring, still training workers who had never seen the inside of an aircraft, let alone built one. The women came from everywhere. Housewives who had never worked outside the home, single girls fresh out of high school, mothers with small children who dropped them at newly constructed daycare centres adjacent to the factories before clocking in for their shift, working-class wives, widows, divorcees, students who needed the money. They learned on the job. They learned from each other. They learned by making mistakes that cost hours of rework, by misreading blueprints, by drilling holes in the wrong location, by stripping threads, by dropping tools into inaccessible parts of the fuselage. And then they learned not to make those mistakes again. By the end of 1942, the American aircraft industry would produce 46,907 aircraft, more than twice the 18,466 produced in 1941. Women did not build all of them, but without women the number would have been a fraction of that total. April 1942. Ypsilanti, Michigan. Willow Run, the factory that was supposed to change everything. Henry Ford's vision was industrial totalitarianism applied to aircraft production. A single building, 1 mile long, containing the entire production line for the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. Raw materials would enter one end. Finished aircraft would emerge from the other. 1 bomber every hour. That was the promise. The building itself was completed in 1941, an architectural enormity that dominated the flat Michigan landscape. The production line was installed through early 1942. The first B-24 rolled out in September 1942. By the end of the year, Willow Run had produced 56 aircraft. 56 aircraft in a factory designed to produce 1 per hour. The problems were everywhere and multiplied. Shortages of machine tools, shortages of skilled labor, shortages of raw materials. The logistics of moving sub-assemblies through a mile-long building proved more complex than anticipated. The workforce, drawn from rural Michigan and from the South, had no experience with aircraft manufacturing. Training programs could not keep pace with hiring. Turnover was high. Absenteeism was high. Housing near the factory was inadequate, forcing workers to commute long distances, which increased fatigue and decreased productivity. And the B-24 itself was a difficult aircraft to manufacture, more complex than the B-17, heavier. The fuselage was deeper, requiring workers to navigate tighter internal spaces. The wings used a different construction method, a Davis airfoil that was aerodynamically efficient but structurally intricate. Every bomber required 1.2 million parts, 313,000 rivets, 20,000 feet of electrical wiring. Women were hired at Willow Run from the beginning, but in 1942 they were still a minority. The factory culture was chaotic. Management was learning how to manage at scale. Foremen were learning how to translate automotive assembly techniques to aircraft production. The workers were learning how to build something far more complicated than a car. Willow Run would eventually succeed. By April 1944, it would produce 453 aircraft in a single month, achieving a production rate of 1 bomber every 63 minutes. By the end of the war, Willow Run would manufacture 8,685 B-24 bombers, more than any other plant. But in 1942, it was a symbol of ambition outpacing capability. The women who worked there in 1942 worked through the chaos. They worked through the disorganization, the bad management, the poor planning that characterized the factory's early months. They worked because the production schedule demanded it. They worked because there was no alternative. The question that haunted 1942 was not whether women could do the work. By mid-year, that question had been answered. The question was whether enough women could be recruited, trained, and retained to meet production targets that kept escalating. The War Manpower Commission was established in April 1942 to coordinate labor allocation across the war economy. Its mandate included encouraging employers to hire women, to place them in positions previously reserved for men, to expand training programs, to provide childcare facilities, to adjust shift schedules to accommodate family responsibilities. The government launched recruitment campaigns. Posters appeared in post offices, in train stations, in factory cafeterias. Women in the war, we can't win without them. The girl he left behind is still behind him. She's a WOW, woman ordnance worker. Later, there would be Rosie the Riveter, the most famous icon of the entire effort. But in 1942, Rosie was just beginning to appear, a cultural construct that had not yet solidified into mythology. The recruitment worked. Between 1940 and 1944, the number of employed women rose by 50%. The number of employed married women rose by 76%. By 1943, over 15 million women would be in the workforce, nearly 3.5 million of them on war work. But the recruitment was never sufficient. There were never enough workers. The production targets kept rising. Roosevelt's initial call for 60,000 aircraft in 1942 was revised. By late 1942, projections anticipated 39,000 planes by year's end, ramping to 49,000 in 1943. Every additional 1,000 aircraft required thousands of additional workers. Every worker required training, supervision, housing, transportation, childcare. The factories operated around the clock. 3 shifts, day, swing, night. The day shift started at 7 a.m., ended at 3 p.m. The swing shift ran from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. The night shift, the hardest, the one that disrupted sleep patterns and family routines most severely, ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Women worked all 3. They worked overtime, they worked weekends. In February 1943, Executive Order 9301 would establish a 48-hour minimum work week in critical war industries. But in 1942, many workers were already exceeding 48 hours. 60-hour weeks were common. Some skilled workers, particularly in aircraft factories, worked 95-hour weeks, including entire weekends. The wages varied. Average weekly earnings for women in aircraft factories hovered around $40 to $6 per week in 1942, though this data comes from British factories, and American wages were structured differently. American women in war plants typically earned less than men performing the same work, but more than they had earned in pre-war employment. The money mattered. Many were supporting families. Many were sending money to husbands overseas. Many were simply trying to survive in an economy where rationing and inflation were eroding purchasing power. The work was exhausting. The noise was relentless. The air quality inside the factories was poor. Metal dust, chemical fumes, inadequate ventilation. Injuries were common. Drill bits broke and sent metal fragments flying. Rivet guns misfired. Heavy parts slipped from cranes and struck workers. Fingers were crushed, hands burned, eyes damaged by sparks. There were no extended breaks. Lunch was 30 minutes, eaten in factory cafeterias that served thousands of workers per shift. Bathrooms were crowded, often unsanitary. Medical facilities were minimal. If you were injured, you received first aid and returned to work, or you were sent home without pay. And yet, the turnover rate decreased. And yet, productivity increased. And yet the aircraft kept rolling off the assembly lines in numbers that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. July 1942, San Diego, California, Consolidated Aircraft, the B-24 Liberator, 4 engines, wingspan 110 feet, empty weight 36,500 pounds, maximum takeoff weight 65,000 pounds, 10 crew members, range 2,100 miles with a 5,000-pound bomb load. Consolidated Aircraft was the original manufacturer of the B-24, the company that designed it, that held the production contracts before the War Department began licensing the design to Ford, to Douglas, to North American Aviation. In 1942, Consolidated's San Diego factory was the largest single employer in the region, with tens of thousands of workers spread across multiple buildings and outdoor assembly areas. Women were involved in every phase of production. They assembled fuselages, working in teams to position massive sections onto jigs, to align bolt holes, to drive rivets through overlapping aluminum sheets. They operated drill presses, shaping metal parts to specifications measured in thousandths of an inch. They worked on electrical assemblies, wiring the complex systems that controlled engines, navigation instruments, bomb release mechanisms, turret motors. Margarita Pauletto was 20 years old in November 1943 when she became the first woman drop hammer operator at Consolidated, stamping out metal parts in Department 205. But she was not the first woman in the factory. By late 1942, hundreds of women were already working the production line, and their numbers were increasing every week. The work culture was different from civilian life. Camaraderie developed among workers who shared shifts, who shared tasks, who shared the experience of being thrust into an industrial environment that was foreign and demanding. Many women became roommates, pooling resources to rent apartments in a city overwhelmed by wartime housing shortages. They socialized together outside work, attended movies, went dancing, navigated a world where most of the young men were gone. Some were married, their husbands serving overseas. They wrote letters, waited for mail, lived in a state of suspended uncertainty. Some were single, navigating the attention of male co-workers, supervisors, strangers on buses who saw the work clothes and made assumptions. Some were older, widows or divorcees, for whom the factory job represented financial independence they had never experienced. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for most of the war. The outdoor assembly areas were lit by floodlights at night, creating a surreal landscape of partially assembled bombers casting long shadows across concrete. The noise carried for miles. Residents of nearby neighborhoods learned to sleep through it, or they didn't sleep well for the duration of the war. By December 1943, Consolidated's production lines were operating at peak efficiency. B-24s were being assembled inside and outside, with final assembly occurring in massive hangars before the aircraft were towed to the flight line for testing. The pace was relentless. The pressure was constant. There was no room for error because every bomber that left San Diego was destined for combat, and every defect, every missed rivet, every misaligned component could mean the difference between survival and death for the crew that flew it. The women understood this. They worked knowing that their hands, their drills, their rivet guns were directly connected to the lives of men they would never meet, men who would fly into hostile skies at 27,000 feet over Europe, over the Pacific, over landscapes that were abstractions in newspapers, but deadly real to the crews that navigated them. By autumn 1942, the American war economy had reorganized itself around a central fact. Production was no longer constrained by labor alone. It was constrained by materials: steel, aluminum, copper. These were the critical inputs. Everything else, rubber, fabric, electronics, engines, depended on the availability of these three metals. In October 1942, the Roosevelt administration adopted the Controlled Materials Plan, a logistical framework that regulated the flow of steel, aluminum, and copper to prioritized industries. The plan was deceptively simple. It did not attempt to manage every aspect of production. It did not regulate wages or prices directly. It did not dictate hiring practices or shift schedules. What it did was allocate materials according to strategic priorities, leaving individual industries and companies to manage their own production decisions within those constraints. Aircraft manufacturing was at the top of the priority list, so was shipbuilding, tank production, artillery. The civilian economy was pushed to the margins. Automobile production for civilian use was suspended. Construction of new homes slowed to a trickle. Consumer goods became scarce, then rare, then unavailable. The factories consumed materials at a staggering rate. A single B-17 required approximately 20,000 pounds of aluminum. A B-24 required slightly more. In 1942, American factories produced over 46,000 aircraft, which meant over 900 million pounds of aluminum went into airframes alone. Add engines, propellers, landing gear, instruments, guns, and the total material consumption was almost incomprehensible. The Controlled Materials Plan worked because it accepted a fundamental truth. War production could not be managed from the top down. It had to be coordinated at a high level, but executed locally, factory by factory, company by company, shift by shift. The women on the factory floor did not know about the Controlled Materials Plan. They did not attend the meetings in Washington where allocation decisions were made. They worked within the results of those decisions. Materials arrived or they didn't. Production schedules adjusted or they didn't. Shifts were extended or they weren't. What they knew was the work, the immediacy of it, the physicality, the drill bit, biting into aluminum, the pneumatic hiss of the rivet gun, the smell of hot metal, the weight of a wrench, the precise torque required to tighten a bolt without stripping the thread, the visual check, alignment, spacing, surface finish, the muscle memory that developed after weeks of repetition so that the hands moved almost without conscious thought, guided by experience rather than deliberation. This was not skilled labor in the traditional sense. It was not carpentry or masonry or blacksmithing, crafts honed over years of apprenticeship. It was industrial labor, repetitive and specific, learned quickly and executed under time pressure. But it required precision. It required focus. It required the ability to sustain concentration hour after hour, day after day, week after week, under conditions that were physically uncomfortable and mentally exhausting. And it required acceptance of the fact that you were a replaceable component in a system that was far larger than any individual, larger than any single factory, larger even than the totality of American industry. You were part of a machine, and the machine was producing the instruments of war at a scale that had never been attempted before. December 1942, Long Beach, California, Douglas aircraft, the C-47 Skytrain, twin engines, wingspan 95 feet, empty weight 18,000 pounds, maximum takeoff weight 31,000 pounds, cargo capacity 6,000 pounds or 28 troops, range 1,600 miles. The C-47 was the military version of the DC-3, the most successful civilian airliner of the pre-war era. It was not a bomber, it was a transport designed to carry troops, cargo, medical supplies, equipment. It was also the aircraft that would drop paratroopers over Normandy in 1944, that would fly the hump over the Himalayas supplying China, that would evacuate wounded from forward airfields across the Pacific. Douglas aircraft manufactured C-47s at multiple locations, but the Long Beach plant was among the largest. Women worked there in every capacity, riveting fuselage sections, assembling wing subassemblies, operating drill presses, installing electrical systems. The work was less publicized than bomber production, but no less essential. Without transports, the logistical tail of the American military machine could not function. Without transports, forward air bases could not be supplied. Without transports, wounded could not be evacuated. The C-47 was unglamorous, but it was ubiquitous, and it was built by the thousands, many of them by women whose names were never recorded, whose contributions were acknowledged in aggregate rather than individually. The photographs from Long Beach in late 1942 show women working in pairs, riveting leading-edge sub-assemblies. They are young, most of them, dressed in overalls or dungarees, hair tied back, safety glasses pushed up on foreheads, faces partially obscured by shadow. The images are black and white, grainy, the lighting harsh. The women are looking at their work, not at the camera. There is no sense of drama in these photographs, no heroism. Just labor. Just the repetitive act of placing a rivet, positioning the gun, pulling the trigger, checking the result, moving to the next rivet. The work does not look difficult. It looks tedious. It looks like something anyone could do with a few weeks of training, which was precisely the point. The transformation of American industry in 1942 was not a story of dramatic innovation. It was a story of scale, of logistics, of the systematic application of existing techniques to production volumes that had never been attempted. The factories themselves were not new. Boeing's Seattle plant had been manufacturing aircraft since the 1930s. Consolidated's San Diego facility dated to the same era. Douglas, Lockheed, North American Aviation, all were established companies with experienced workforces and proven production methods. What changed in 1942 was the tempo, the intensity, the relentless pressure to produce more, faster, with fewer resources, with workers who were less experienced, under conditions that were improvisational and chaotic. The government provided contracts, funding, priorities. It established production targets, allocated materials, coordinated labor recruitment. But the government did not build the aircraft. The factories did. The workers did. The women who had never held a rivet gun before January 1942, and who were operating rivet guns with professional competence by June 1942, did. This was the hidden machinery of the war effort, not the battles, not the strategy, not the generals or the admirals or the politicians. The machinery was the factories. The machinery was the women working night shifts, drilling holes, riveting aluminum, assembling subcomponents, checking tolerances, inspecting finished work, moving on to the next task because the line never stopped. January 1943. 1 year after the Pearl Harbor widows walked through the doors at Lockheed, American aircraft production in 1942 totaled 46,907 units, an increase of 154% over 1941. Production would continue to accelerate. In 1943, American factories would produce 84,853 aircraft. In 1944, 96,270. The peak monthly production would occur in March 1944, but the foundation was built in 1942. The women who built that foundation did not see themselves as historical figures. They saw themselves as workers. They clocked in. They performed their tasks. They clocked out. They went home, or to boarding houses, or to cramped apartments shared with roommates. They slept. They returned the next day and did it again. Some kept diaries. Kathleen Church Bliss and Elsie Whiteman, two British women who volunteered for war work in an aircraft components factory, kept a joint diary that documented the poor conditions, the disorganization, the bad management, but also the social freedom that war work provided. American women had similar experiences. Some wrote letters to husbands overseas, describing the work, the factory, the exhaustion, the satisfaction of contributing. Most did not write anything. They simply lived through it. The factories paid wages. The wages were insufficient, but they were wages nonetheless. They provided a degree of economic independence that many women had never experienced. They provided an alternative to domestic life, to the narrow confines of traditional female employment, teaching, nursing, clerical work, retail. The factory floor was not a liberatory space. It was industrial, hierarchical, often hostile. But it was different. It was a space where competence mattered, where the ability to perform a task efficiently and accurately was valued over appearance or social status. After the war, most of these women would be pushed out of the factories. Production would contract. Men would return from overseas and reclaim jobs. The cultural expectation that women belonged in the home, temporarily suspended during wartime, would reassert itself with institutional force. By 1946, the female workforce in manufacturing would shrink dramatically, but in 1942, none of that was visible. In 1942, the war was new. The outcome was uncertain. The production targets were desperate, and the factories needed everyone who was willing to work. The factory that never slept was not a single location. It was a distributed system. Seattle and San Diego and Long Beach and Burbank and Ypsilanti and Fort Worth and Tulsa and dozens of other sites, all operating simultaneously, all connected by supply chains and material allocations and production schedules that were coordinated at a national level but executed locally. The midnight shift was the hardest. Arriving at the factory at 11 p.m. when the body wanted to sleep, working through the early morning hours when fatigue accumulated and concentration wavered, leaving at 7 a.m. into daylight that felt disorienting, returning to an apartment or a boarding house where neighbors were just beginning their day. The women who worked the midnight shift learned to sleep during the day with curtains drawn, earplugs in, while the world outside continued at normal tempo. They learned to eat meals at odd hours, to navigate a schedule that was inverted from civilian life. They learned to manage the physical toll, the exhaustion, the chronic fatigue, the disrupted circadian rhythms. They also learned that the midnight shift was quieter in its way, fewer supervisors, fewer interruptions, a different rhythm to the work, steadier, less frenetic. The women on the midnight shift developed their own culture, their own camaraderie, bound by the shared experience of working when most of the world was asleep. And the work continued. Holes drilled, rivets driven, parts assembled, inspection performed, quality control maintained. The aircraft took shape, component by component, shift by shift, day by day. By the end of 1942, American factories had produced more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined in the same year. This was not because American engineers were more innovative. It was not because American workers were more skilled. It was because American industry mobilized at a scale and tempo that Axis powers could not match, and it mobilized by recruiting millions of workers who had never worked in factories before, training them rapidly, and putting them to work under conditions that were demanding and sometimes brutal. The women were central to that mobilization, not because they were better workers, but because they were available workers, at a moment when availability was the critical variable. The bomber that took 1.2 million parts to assemble, that required 13,000 rivets, that weighed 36,500 pounds empty and could carry 65,000 pounds fully loaded, was held together by the labour of people who earned a few dollars a day, who worked in factories that were too loud and too hot and too dangerous, who had been recruited with slogans and posters and wages that were better than pre-war employment, but still marginal. The disconnect was total. The technology was sophisticated. The labour was industrial. The workers were replaceable. The product was lethal. A B-24 Liberator cost approximately $300,000 to manufacture in 1942. A crew of 10 trained for months to operate it. The aircraft had a service ceiling of 28,000 feet, a maximum speed of 290 miles per hour, defensive armament of 10 50 caliber machine guns. It could fly deep into enemy territory, drop its bombs, and return, assuming it was not intercepted by fighters, assuming the flak did not find it, assuming the engines did not fail, assuming the crew did not make a mistake. The women who built it never saw it in combat. They saw it on the assembly line, a skeleton of ribs and spars, then gradually skinned with aluminum, then fitted with engines and turrets and landing gear, then painted, then towed to the flight line for testing. And then it was gone, flown to a staging base, assigned to a crew, sent overseas. Whether it survived its first mission, its 10th, its 20th, whether it was shot down over Germany or the Pacific, whether its crew lived or died, none of that information returned to the factory floor. The women who built it moved on to the next aircraft, and the next, and the next. There was no elegance in this, no poetry, just the grinding machinery of industrial war, operating at maximum capacity, sustained by workers who showed up every day because the alternative was unthinkable. The factory that never slept was a machine that consumed human labour and raw materials and transformed them into instruments of destruction. This was not hidden. This was not obscure. Everyone involved understood what they were building and why. The moral calculus was simple. American bombers were necessary to defeat fascism. Defeating fascism was a moral imperative. Therefore, building bombers was a moral imperative. This calculus did not address the complexity beneath. It did not address the fact that strategic bombing would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. It did not address the long-term consequences of industrial mobilization on labor relations, on gender roles, on the structure of the American economy. It did not address the human cost of working conditions that were exhausting and dangerous, and that left many workers with chronic injuries, respiratory problems, hearing loss. But in 1942, none of those questions were being asked. Or, if they were being asked quietly, in private, without institutional support. The public narrative was unified. The war had to be won, and winning required production, and production required workers, and workers included women. The women accepted this. They had reasons, economic reasons, patriotic reasons, personal reasons. Some wanted to avenge husbands or brothers or sons. Some wanted financial independence. Some wanted to escape domestic life. Some simply needed a job. The factory did not distinguish between motivations. It only required that the work be done. By late 1942, the War Manpower Commission estimated that nearly 2 million women had been added to the workforce since the beginning of the year, with total female employment reaching over 15 million, approximately 3.5 million of them on war work. This was the largest single mobilization of female labor in American history. It was also temporary. The cultural and institutional forces that would push women out of factories after the war were already present in 1942, visible in wage structures that paid women less than men for identical work, in promotion policies that favored male workers, in media representations that framed women's war work as a temporary sacrifice rather than a permanent shift in labor markets. But for now, in 1942, those forces were secondary. Production was primary. The factories needed workers. Women were workers. The logic was utilitarian, and it was effective. The final aircraft rolled off the assembly line at Boeing Plant No. 2 in April 1944, when production reached 362 bombers in a single month, when the plant was operating at such efficiency that 16 B-17s could be completed in 24 hours. By then, Regina Tolfelt had drilled thousands of holes, maybe tens of thousands. Her hands knew the weight of the drill, the resistance of aluminum, the correct angle and depth without conscious thought. By then, Willow Run had solved its early problems and was producing bombers at a rate approaching Henry Ford's original promise. By then, Consolidated and Douglas and Lockheed and all the other manufacturers were operating at peak capacity, churning out aircraft faster than they could be shipped overseas. By then, the women who had walked into factories in January 1942, uncertain and inexperienced, had become skilled industrial workers. They trained new hires, they supervised shifts, they identified problems before they became defects, they kept the line moving. By then, 1942 was history, the pivot year, the year when potential became reality, when the American war machine transitioned from preparation to execution, when the factories that had been expanding gradually began operating at full capacity, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, month after month, until the war ended. The women who made that possible were never adequately compensated. They were never adequately recognized. After the war, most returned to domestic life or to lower-paying jobs. Their contributions were acknowledged in aggregate. Rosie the Riveter, a cultural icon that flattened individual experiences into a single symbolic figure, but rarely in detail, rarely with attention to the specific conditions they worked under, the specific challenges they overcame, the specific skills they developed. And yet, they were there, in Seattle and San Diego and Long Beach and Burbank and Ypsilanti and Fort Worth and Tulsa, working day shifts and swing shifts and midnight shifts, drilling and riveting and welding and assembling, building the aircraft that would carry the war across oceans, that would drop bombs on industrial centers and military targets, that would bring soldiers home, that would, eventually, end the war. They were there in 1942, the year the factories never slept, the year America's industrial capacity proved decisive. They were there at the beginning, when the outcome was still uncertain, when the production targets seemed impossible, when the work was new and unfamiliar and exhausting. They showed up, they learned, they performed, they built the machines, and the machines won the war. What remains now is quiet. The factories are gone, or repurposed, or converted into museums. Plant No. 2 in Seattle no longer builds bombers. Willow Run became an automotive plant, then partially demolished, its massive interior carved into smaller spaces. Consolidated's San Diego facility was torn down decades ago. The assembly lines are silent. The rivet guns are artifacts. The women who worked there are mostly gone too, passed away in the decades since, their stories preserved in archives if they were preserved at all, lost if they were not. A few remain. Regina Tolfelt was 93 when her story was recorded, one of the last of the 15,000 women who worked at Boeing Seattle. A few others, scattered across the country, their memories fragmentary, their connection to that moment in history increasingly tenuous. 1942 was the year the world discovered that war could be industrialized at a scale previously unimaginable. It was the year America proved that production capacity, not military genius, would determine the outcome. It was the year women became industrial workers in numbers that permanently altered, however briefly, the landscape of American labor. And it was the year the factories never slept, running shifts around the clock, consuming materials and labor, and transforming them into machines that filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific, machines that carried the weight of a war that was decided not by individual heroism, but by industrial output, by the ability to produce more aircraft, more tanks, more ships, more ammunition than the enemy could destroy. The women who built those machines understood, perhaps better than anyone, that they were not heroes. They were workers, and the work, relentless and exhausting and essential, was enough.